One of the common threads that I see throughout all spiritual traditions, the intuition is you are not your thoughts.
Mm.
And when we have that moment of actually seeing that, even for a microsecond, that is a moment of enlightenment. That is so critical.
You know those thoughts running around in your head all day long, the ones telling you you should or you shouldn't, you like or you hate, what this person did, what that person did. Today, my guests and I speak about the identification that we have with those thoughts in our head and what happens when we realize that we're more than our thoughts. In fact, much, much more than we could ever possibly imagine. Today's guests are Rob Schmidt and Stuart Goodnick, longtime spiritual teachers with the Tai-Yu Meditation Center. Together, they carry forward a modern expression of the fourth way tradition by Gurdjieff, bringing deep attention, self-observation, and heart-centered awareness into everyday life. Rob and Stuart are also the co-hosts of the Mystical Positivist podcast and co-founders of Many Rivers Book and Tea, a community hub devoted to genuine spiritual inquiry. For over 4 decades, they have been helping people wake up from automatic living through conversation with oneself, with others, and across spiritual traditions. Their work is thoughtful, grounded, and refreshingly honest, offering a path for people who want a spiritual life without the bypassing. Make sure to listen to the end to hear the one thing that they want you to know more than anything. Hey guys, welcome, Stuart and Rob to the Intuition Incubator. How are you guys doing today?
Well, thank you for having us. We're doing great.
I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. So we met, actually, just for the audience, at a Red Hawk retreat. Red Hawk's been on the podcast, and we met at an ashram in Arizona and found some commonalities. So here we are. And you guys do Tai-Yu meditation. Yeah?
That's right. Yes. So the founder of Tai-Yu studied with a guy in Southern California in the 70s. And so I met Robert Daniel Ennis, the founder of Tai-Yu, in 1978, and have been doing that form of meditation. It formally derives off of the fourth way practices, but Robert innovated something of the principal practice in the fourth way is called self-observation, which is not a process that the mind would be able to describe, because it's a sensing of all the phenomena to which we're subject from a non-discursive point of view. That is, if it's talking in your head, it's not self-observation. But if it's witnessing without words, that's self-observation. Robert Ennis applied that to human communication. And so he created a whole series of elaborations of that to allow for people to be present to one another without judgments, discursive judgments getting in the way.
Excuse me while I guffaw at where we find ourselves today.
Well, conversation doesn't have to involve discursive judgments. That's the practice. That's the co-meditation practice, as it's called.
What Red Hawk has talked about on this program derives from the fourth way tradition of G.I. Gurdjieff. And the principal meditation practices, the principal practices that he described are self-observation and self-remembering. And what our teacher, Robert Ennis, as Rob was saying, innovated is what he calls co-meditation. And co-meditation, as Rob said, is really about applying those tools, but in the context of interpersonal interaction. So when we're in conversation, we can be present, we can be self-observing, we can be sensing our body, we can be not identifying with the thoughts that arise in relationship to what a person that we're talking to is saying. And that is quite distinguished from what we often find ourselves doing, which is being in conversation, waiting for the other person to finish so we can say what we want to say.
So I'll back up slightly. So co-meditation is about being present to the other person and what the other person of a dyad is trying to communicate. But if there's the phenomenon happening, very common, we see it enacted around us all, from childhood on. If the phenomenon works as Stuart pointed out, where one person is not really listening to what the other person is saying, and making room in the psyche for it, then in fact, what's happening is that people are talking at cross purposes, not really engaging. And so the co-meditation practice is training, it's practice to be able to listen to the other person and then respond in whatever authentic way arises, not based on projections or something else.
Which is so challenging. And I think, even at the retreat that we were on, like a really profound exercise that I think we went through that, it's so interesting every time it lands. But when we were asked to, as a group over our meal, to review, the learnings. Do you guys remember that? We were asked to review our learnings of the morning or that day. And then at dinner, we discussed how that review went. Everybody was really very dissatisfied with it. Mm-hmm. And then we had a conversation about what was really happening, which I think was a lot of that, because we are humans and we go unconscious and we do these things. Mm-hmm. And then the next conversation, we were all very top of mind, like, let's be very careful to listen. I found that really such a great live example of that. But mm-hmm. before we go on, I have so many questions for you guys, but just for our listeners, can you because you've mentioned the fourth way a couple of times, mm-hmm. which is Gurdjieff's method, can you speak to it? Just tell us what that is.
Sure. So the fourth way tradition is a spiritual practice, spiritual school or way of working that was introduced to the West by a mystic named G.I. Gurdjieff in the early part of the 20th century. So he is an interesting character, Armenian and Greek by ethnicity, grew up in Central Asia under the Russian Empire, and
in the late 1800s.
Yeah, in the late 1800s, probably born in 1877. So in that time period, made a lot of trips, studied a lot, was exposed to a lot of traditions, but a lot of his background is somewhat cloaked in mystery, probably intentionally. There's a number of sources that he probably drew upon, but most significantly, he came back to Russia in I think 1912 or so.
In 1912, he started a study group, I guess you'd call it, in St. Petersburg, and then following in Moscow.
Right, and at that time, there were some now somewhat well-known students of his, like P.D. Ouspensky, who has a number of books out, including one where he documented some of the early talks of Gurdjieff called In Search of the Miraculous. But Gurdjieff began with those teachings in Russia, but when the Russian Revolution went down, he and his community of students made these kind of heroic and quite dangerous trip.
A trek to escape. At first, landing for a brief time in Istanbul after a lot of adventures, and then finally looking for a permanent place to continue his work. Gurdjieff eventually landed near Paris, and they bought an estate called Fontainebleau, and then Gurdjieff made many travels to disperse the practices that he had brought with him.
Yeah, so he made some trips to the United States, to England, and during this period of time, he was actively maintaining an institute, and then he had a serious car accident, which caused I guess you'd say, a pause in the active activities of the Institute. But after, in his recovery, he began to write very seriously. And out of this, he produced 3 series of writings. One of the most famous is called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, or also All and Everything, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which is this 1,028-page koan that's very difficult to read because it's really allegory upon allegory, written in a tradition that was probably likens back to the old oral storytellers. And so it has a wonderful, beautiful cadence, but it's very deep and requires a lot of reading and study in order to really find your way through what he's actually saying. So he had, besides Ouspensky, a number of other students like Orage, J.G. Bennett, and he died in 1949, right?
Yes.
And subsequent to that, there's been kind of many lines of work that came from people who worked with Gurdjieff. There are foundations today. There's other lines of people who studied with students of Gurdjieff, and that fourth way tradition has continued on. Red Hawk is a good example of someone who partakes of that tradition, as well as, no doubt you heard, other devotionally based traditions. But at the core of it is a kind of language, a kind of sensibility that's grounded in these practices of self-observation and self-remembering. And its principal diagnosis of the challenge that we face as contemporary humans is that we live most of our lives in a kind of waking sleep, where our lives are mediated by the thoughts we have, the feelings we have, the sensations we have, and we typically move bouncing around from external stimuli to internal stimuli, mechanically responding to pre-programmed dispositions based off of these kinds of internal events, and can't really be said to be independently conscious or self-owning.
Well, self-directed.
Yeah.
Which is a hard sell, right? I mean, yeah. Because I think that many people listening might feel like, what are you talking about? I'm totally self-directed.
Exactly. And that illusion is addressed head on in the fourth way. At least Gurdjieff tried to directly point out to people that the illusory aspects of that claim, that, oh, I'm self-directed.
Yeah.
But really it's more habits that people develop willy-nilly throughout their lives, and then have very few tools to genuinely examine both those habits and the effects of those habits on their lives.
A lot of people, I think, when they hear this kind of thing, I think there's also part of that habit, and that human condition habit is to say, okay, well, teach me what I need to know so that I can stop doing that and not have that mechanical part anymore. And you guys have been studying this now for 30, 40 years, right? So
even more.
Even more. So what do you have to say to that, to your own experience with that?
So I was 24 years old when I met my teacher, but it came at a time in my life when I was aware that my capacity for relationship was constrained by something in me. I mean, I subsequently came to call those constraints habits, but I didn't have that language at the time. So that was my arena of interest. What Stuart forgot to mention is that in addition to all this internal examination, is that Gurdjieff also created an elaborate cosmological explanation for the situation that the human race finds itself in, which is laid out in the Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson that Stuart mentioned earlier. And in addition to these self-observation and self-remembering practices, also he created this really powerful tool called the Gurdjieff movements. sacred dances, in other words, where people's bodily habits are very much foregrounded and made the object of scrutiny. So that's another aspect of the Gurdjieff work.
So I'd like to mention, what do you say to people about this, and what's the recommendation? There's several things that I would say. One is that although the work is hard and challenging, and there are all sorts of ways in which we can fool ourselves, our teacher's teacher had the adage, no effort is wasted. Mm-hmm. So no matter what you do, any action you take to promote even a particle of self-consciousness in a moment is something that you retain. And if you make those efforts over and over again, even if they're not intense efforts, there is growth. The more intense the effort, obviously, the faster the growth, but that's typical of any kind of pursuit. The other thing I'd say is that I take an adage from my own music teacher. I study the Japanese bamboo flute with a Japanese master, and although he's in his 80s and so has been playing shakuhachi for over half a century, considers himself a beginner, because the moment he grabs after some sort of self-recognition or self-identification for what he may have accomplished in other people's eyes, he loses touch with that which he's trying to cultivate. The other thing I would say is that humility and humor are useful tools here, because it doesn't matter where we are. There's always more work to do along these lines.
Yeah.
So the first adage that my teacher was fond of in my training was stay awake and pay attention. Yeah. Which kind of summarizes this. Now, there are ways to pay attention with a part of the organism that does not speak, is not reliant upon the what Gurdjieff called the formatory apparatus, or the voices in our heads that most of us are subject to. But there are ways to pursue self-observation through the other capacities of the human organism that we are generally not even pointed out, but certainly not celebrated as they are in, so right now I don't have, a lot of thoughts in my head. I'm simply speaking from whatever place it is that allows me to speak. Sometimes that has to be trained, because very early in the childhood that I experienced, I came to rely on the voices in my head as reference points. But some of the features of the fourth way, because the conceptual realm is de-emphasized, then it turns out that actually we do have capacities that we didn't believe we had. And so it's possible to go through life without having voices in your head, or having to rely at least upon voices in your head. Now, that's not always true. I mean, I went through grad school at a prominent institution and got a PhD, and I had voices going on in my head. But when I would engage with another person, I didn't have to use that common referent internally. Instead, I could rely on this capacity that Robert pointed out, that we all innately have, but simply we've not been trained in. And in fact, we received support in not relying on that capacity.
You're talking about like spouting off what you know and what's common knowledge in your head, but instead just speaking more
from the heart.
From the heart.
From the heart, or from the body, or from all three centers. I mean, that's actually another aspect we haven't mentioned about the fourth way, is that the human organism is divided up into three, to some extent four centers, and then we can rely upon that analysis to understand how it feels in the body, how the sensory experience in the body feels when certain centers are active and creating our external presentation.
And of course, we rely primarily and most heavily on the intellectual center, and we believe.
Well, that was my weakness.
Well,
mine as well.
That's pretty typical of our society.
Right.
We foreground the intellectual center, and we tend to ignore the emotional center, and to some extent supercharge our thoughts with heavy-duty sort of instinctive feelings like fear or attraction, and we create this non-subtle false personality, as it's said in the fourth way. In other traditions, it's the ego. In our own teacher, I like to call it the android. It looks like a human and acts like a human. And in this day of AI, this is probably even a more important metaphor than ever. But it's not human,
or it's not. It doesn't draw upon the uniquely human capacities,
right,
and even support examinations of what might be called the mystical realm.
Yeah, well, because all that intellectual center, just like a good large language model in AI, is a compendium of past experience. So if you want to live your life looking in a rearview mirror, you can rely on your ego or your false personality or your android. But being a human, a true human, with the inheritance of our various capacities, means being in the present and living your life in the moment and being responsive to what's happening now as opposed to what happened in your past.
Which allows really for intuition in many ways, right? People have different ways of explaining intuition, but to me, if I'm in my head, I'm not being intuitive. Like, there's nothing intuitive that ever comes out of the drivel that goes on in my mind about, well, it should be this or it should be that, or maybe I'll try this or maybe I'll try that, or it's very non-intuitive. Hence the name of this podcast, right? The Intuition Incubator. Like, we need to incubate this again. One of the things we were talking about before we got on is, as you started out talking about communication and the projections that we have, that what's happening in the inner world and what we are projecting out into the outer world, and particularly the people that are around us and the impact of that. And I think that's a really important topic to have you guys elaborate on, because so much of the time, I think people are so identified with the thoughts in their head that they don't even realize that those are a projection and how that is impacting their relationships and the conversations that they're having.
Well, that's a deep topic.
Yeah.
I'll try to sketch a few truths that I've learned about it, which is that what I didn't at first realize when initially engaging in co-meditation practice is that the habit of making judgments about our experience is so deep, at least for me, was so deeply buried, as it were, such that I had to actually look at the operation of my mind in many different circumstances. One of the key attributes of self-observation is that, in contrast to Asian forms of spirituality, you don't have to go sit in a special space or take time out of your day. It's actually best to do self-observation in the midst of daily life. So I came to see that as I'm walking down the street, there are people that it's very quick. These judgments become very quick with 24 years of experience in my initial case. The judgments are very quick about I want to go towards that person or away from that person. In fact, I'll even cross the street to avoid that person, or I'll cross the street to engage with that other person. So those things are very not obvious to a person who hasn't engaged in some kind of spiritual practice, at least. And certainly observation and co-meditation are designed to put your attention on those features of your makeup.
And so I'm just thinking that maybe somebody's listening going, so what? Like, so what? I want to cross the street, or I don't want to cross the street. What's wrong with that?
Well,
there's nothing wrong with it.
Right.
That's the point.
There's nothing wrong with it, and there's nothing right with it. The interesting question is, are you consciously choosing to cross the street, or are you in reaction to something that you're not even really aware is manifesting? And so in this kind of practice, besides putting attention on another person with co-meditation and being present with another person with full attention, there is a fourth way practice that's called conscious suffering. And conscious suffering, in one formulation that Gurdjieff uses, is the willingness to endure the displeasing manifestations of another towards oneself. And what that
means, I love that saying. Let's just get it out so we can really...
Willingness to endure the displeasing manifestations of another towards oneself.
Towards oneself, yeah. I love that.
This is, he's quoting in All and Everything, Saint Buddha, I think, in this particular chapter, in this articulation of conscious suffering or intentional suffering. I don't remember if it's intentional or conscious in that context, but the idea behind it, though, is that we have an internal sort of warning system that can be repurposed as a tool for awakening. That warning system is that thing within us that causes us to want to avoid things. We sometimes recommend people follow your dread as opposed to following your bliss, because that internal warning that makes you want to cross the street or avoid a difficult conversation with someone, or not pick up a phone and make a cold call if you're a salesperson, all the different ways in which this comes up is the very thing that drives unconscious behavior and avoidance. And so one practice with conscious suffering is to intentionally push yourself through that as if energetic barrier and be present and be self-observing and see what happens.
And I mean, to go a little deeper with it, the Tai-Yu founder, Robert Ennis, was also influenced by Buddhism. And so particularly Zen, and he sometimes jokingly called Tai-Yu cowboy Zen. So there's a prayer in Zen called the Shin Shin Ming, which is all about abandoning, turning away from the habit of judging, which is part of the function, not of that capacity of humans that is senior to the mind chattering away in our heads, but it can be trained, it can be educated, but not through language. So, but that neither bad nor good, neither beautiful or ugly, none of the identifications, that's a prominent term in the fourth way, because Gurdjieff said that, when we're identified with an idea, a thought, an emotion, a sensation, we are not self-directed, which is part of the answer I could have offered earlier to your question about self-direction, or response to self-direction. So these distinctions that arise only in language, pretty much, are too often a vehicle for identification with something that is not innate to our fundamental nature. And so the assertion to be tested in the fourth way is, well, if that's true and people are unhappy, presumably because of these identifications, then maybe working to release identifications could increase human happiness, efficiency, co-creative possibilities.
Yeah, so let's break down these identifications a little bit, because I think it is a huge piece of the work and really important to understand. So can you offer some just really basic, concrete examples of an identification so people can really understand what we're saying here?
Yeah, so an identification may be a self-judgment. I'm stupid. I'm smart. I'm tired. I don't feel well. I'm scared. These are all I statements that are identifications. But it can also be if you see someone that you may know, oh, I don't like him, he's just like my dad.
He's doing that wrong.
Right.
Or he's self-centered or full of himself or rude or...
Yeah.
Right. And so there's just a myriad of different, typically I statements will run by, I can't do that. I can't possibly do that. That's not me. I don't like that. I don't enjoy going outdoors. I don't enjoy nature, or maybe the opposite. I have to. I enjoy nature. If I don't go for my walk, this morning, then I'm going to be crabby all day. These things all run very quickly, and these are simple examples. They can get more subtle, but typically the subtle things about self-judgments. I don't look very good. I don't feel attractive. And so my response to life is to kind of pull in because I don't want to risk rejection, because I think I have this unconscious identification with a thought or a state of being. And this is all predicated around this misunderstanding about what we are and what the nature of our being is. So a lot of times, things about body image is because we're identified with the body. We think of ourselves as our body, and we think of ourselves as having only value in relationship to what other people think about us. And these things are trained in us early on, and they misunderstand fundamental truth about our nature, which I love the way that Red Hawk put it, and he probably said this in your conversation with him, that we're presence and attention happening temporarily to be in a mammal body with all the attendant challenges that presents.
Right. Yeah, so an example of this recently, I recently did a water fast, and on like day 3, my oldest son was like, Mom, you're the only one who is not irritable right now, and you are the only one who has a reason to be. Because they were all hangry, right? It was right around dinner time. I knew I wasn't eating, but they were hangry and they couldn't decide what to eat and all the things. And realizing, like, I was very identified with the idea that I have to eat. I cannot be without food. And not only that, if I'm hangry and someone gets in the way of me and getting to the place where I get to food, then I have a right to be irritable because I told you that I was hangry and you blah, 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 right? And at the end of the day, what I always come back to is that's not really who I want to be, right? I don't care what the circumstances are. I don't want to be bitchy. I don't want to be irritable, even if my mind or my ego tells me I have a right to be and, all of these things. But it was such a stark example of how we get very identified and therefore are not, to your point earlier, in control, like are not self-directed.
Right.
Our habits are directing us, and our thoughts about what we think is right and what we think is wrong is actually leading us along the way.
Yeah. I the way you frame that called something up for me I want to relate, which is an important consideration. The purpose of the work that we're talking about and these practices of self-observation, self-remembering, co-meditation, conscious suffering is not for us to change ourselves.
Right.
And we have to be careful about that, because initially we may see behaviors we don't like and then think, oh, we have to change that. And that the work is a function of will.
And that's actually what this precise point is, where have an effective self-observation practice, you're constantly stepping back, or at least as if metaphorically stepping back, because when you find that there's a judgment arising in you, that's obviously a not listening from or paying attention to the judgments, and so you have to step back behind that, and
That
then
that's
behind
just
that.
another identification.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, I mean, we're talking about a relatively surface level identifications that are available to see, but in many cases, we have created at a very young age. I mean, like 1, 2, 3 years old, and then reinforced over the years of our lives, precisely those identifications, such that it's not even possible to hear it until we gain sufficient capacity, experience, to be able to hear this very quick zip recording that's actually, it's in our head still,
Yeah.
available that way, but we're so used to it zipping by so fast, the track in our head is such a deep groove that we need to allow for that possibility and pay attention for even that level of subtlety. But of course, for the purposes of this conversation, it's also important to note that we don't have to identify with some of the more gross self criticisms, for example, or criticisms of others, for example.
Yeah, and I want to elaborate on the point about not changing yourself. That the purpose is not to change yourself with a particular kind of practice or to become something different. The purpose is to have flexibility in your repertoire. So it may be that it's necessary, as if to, on the surface, not express anger when you become angry. You're not trying to crush the anger
Or suppress it.
You're trying to be in charge of the manifestation so that you wear down the mechanical habit that was there. But once that habit is reduced in intensity such that it no longer commands your behavior and causes identification, you can be angry or not, depending on what the circumstance requires. But the practice sometimes is to work with habits by doing the opposite, just like with following your dread, to do that which is uncomfortable, not because the end result of the physical action is the point. The point is to reduce the intensity of the identification such that you can arrive at a place where life is filled with intentional choice and not mechanical compulsion.
Yeah. So again, to bring this into a concrete example for people who are listening. So if something happens, there's an event that happens and your immediate impulse is to experience anger. There's nothing wrong with that is the impulse, but the body, the human mammal machine, has a habit of expressing anger however you express anger. That might be that you storm out, or that you stuff it, or that you rage, or stand up for yourself, or whatever it is. And the point would be to, in that stance, one option is to what we call swallow the negativity, not meaning stuff it down, but as you said, watch what's happening and be in observance of that. And that doesn't mean that you don't act or that you don't make a choice or a decision or say something. But what it does mean is that you are in control versus the mammal that would just automatically lash out based on habit. And so I like to come up with physical examples that people can really grasp off of, because what we're talking about is somewhat esoteric, or, could be seen that way. But I was wondering, Rob, when you said, we were talking about surface level examples of identification, what would be a deeper, a less surface level example of an identification?
Well, so maybe more pervasive the habit might be less obvious at first. So an example of that might be how I am viewed by other people. In other words, that's kind of the basic attitude that I've created, because in the past, maybe someone, characterized the way they responded to me based on something I was doing or not doing. So I developed this consideration that I don't want to be seen as doing that or not doing the other thing in some way. And that becomes, at a lot of levels, almost invisible. It's so automatic that that given sufficient time and attention, nothing really is going on in my organism that I cannot. At least I take that to be the product of my experience in self-observation and co-meditation, but takes a while. And that's why with co-meditation, we recommend that people do the co-meditation practice with as many types of people as possible, because we get triggered by different either types of people or people with different habits of presentation or of expression. And so the whole of our past in these bodies can produce lingering effects that are not as readily discernible, but nothing is outside the realm of discernment eventually.
And so what does this co-meditation look like? Like what do you do exactly?
Well, the practice is to do this, is to sit.
You come closer.
So for everybody listening, Rob just turned his chair to face
one practice or one form is to simply maintain eye contact with another person.
That's right.
In silence.
Right. That's the basic.
That's the basic form.
That's the basic form. But at this point, having close to 50 years of experience in co-meditation, I do co-meditation without announcing it with people in the grocery store, people in any context. And I don't have to announce it. I'm just putting my full attention on them, not judging them.
It doesn't have to be formalized. You don't have to have a staring contest. You can just have actually relaxed full attention on someone.
Right. But compared to what we were doing just a moment ago, Stuart and I, that's the basic form of the practice to get proficient at being present to another person without actually projecting judgments onto them.
Yeah, and we have variations of the practice that will engage various centers, so that you may be doing something, or one partner is doing something while another is putting full attention on their partner. There are forms where one person may be speaking about something that's important for them, and then the other person is paying full attention and not reacting, but being present, fully present, but not
acknowledging.
Yeah. And what these practices do are manifold. There's lots of different ways. But for one thing, we often confront unconscious habits we have on how we're in relationship with other people. Like, how do we feel if someone's putting attention on you, but you're not getting cues from them? That can be very disconcerting, because there's a part of us that's looking for certain kinds of cues.
Whether positive or negative, actually. But the point is to be able to witness the co-meditation partner with ease, with generosity, actually, because it is a generous thing to take your attention off your own internal dialogue,
right,
and put the attention on another person. But our contention would be that this is actually really good to understand another person or other people. So, I've used this technique and learned from it, throughout, since I was 24. Aspects of it can become second nature the more you practice these different forms that Robert at first created, and then we've elaborated after his passing.
But there are practical benefits. Like I have worked in a career in the corporate world in a engineering function, but at a high enough level where I'm dealing with upper management, and I find that the ability to be present to other people is very important in a business context. And more importantly, when you're speaking, if you are able to speak but be aware and present with the other person, then you can see how you're being heard. And then if you can see how you're being heard, you can be responsible for the quality of the communication. And then you can also stop and let other people engage and to listen to them. And it changes the quality of the interaction. Sometimes we speak of executive presence as this kind of mystery that either you got it or you don't in the business world. But really, it's something that can be learned, and it's learned by tools like this. Executive presence is someone who is present and essentially present in the sense that they're not identified, so they feel like they have a right to be there, and they're present to everyone around them and are able to engage, whether people hire them in the hierarchy or lower them in the hierarchy. It doesn't really matter. They just act the same. And that changes the way you show up and the way that people receive you in business contexts.
I love that you brought that up, because I actually talk about that in the trailer of this podcast, this hierarchy that we live in, and how part of my goal with my own conditioning was really to eradicate that idea in my head that I'm less than or better than. I feel like it's such an epidemic that we have, and this assumption that we make, even just famous people, let's say actors, famous actors or whatever, or people in quote prominent positions or something, or the student in the class that got the A, and where I got the B or the C or whatever. These assumptions that we have that we're better than or less than, that get in our way of this human connection. And I'm thinking about what you're talking about, which sounds a lot to me, at least an overlap with divided attention, which Red Hawk talks about. But it seems to me that if I'm practicing what you are discussing, I could almost feel it even while you were talking about it. There's like an automatic heart opening. Mm-hmm. If I'm doing that properly, if I'm really just sitting and dialing in. Is that accurate?
Well, I was just thinking as you were talking about my own experience of teaching in academia. And I didn't teach for more than a few years because there were opportunities to vary from the lecturer mode, which I really did not enjoy personally. What fed me was running a seminar class and trying to encourage the participants in a seminar to engage in essentially not really a formal co-meditation, but really to facilitate the practice of mutual respect in that sort of context. That was really fun. But I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
And to respond to the question, that you were describing, when we use the terminology that co-meditation activates the emotional center, that's what you're feeling.
Yeah.
We could also say it's opening the heart, but it's engaging the emotional center, which it's not a mystery. It's a natural part of us, but we engage it by relationship. We engage it by being present and not mediating everything through the activities of our mind and our identifications.
And do you feel like intuition, would it be fair to say that intuition would be a natural evolution of putting yourself in that state, that you would be more highly intuitive or make a more intuitive rather than intellectual decision?
I would assert that actually everyone has intuitions. They just are not in the habit
right.
of putting attention on them. There may be habits of suppressing that kind of information, or suppressing the, operating from an idea that I don't get to express intuitions, maybe in certain contexts, or maybe in every context. But I actually think that it's the obstacles to the expression of intuition that we can realize don't need to be there.
Yeah, and I would agree. It is a necessary, I guess it's necessary but not sufficient to enter this kind of space for intuition to flourish. But because it is a capacity that we have so undertrained, we also have
or even suppressed.
Yeah, so we also have to practice listening to our intuition, so that we can create the context in the ways that we're talking about, with opening our heart, with co-meditation, with self-observation and self-remembering, by getting space between our presence and the operation of our mind. And then we have to tune in and be willing to actively to receive intuitive information and not immediately judge it away.
Follow through with it, right? And have the courage.
Right, and be prepared to make mistakes. I mean, it's like not everything that comes through maybe is reliable, but you don't know that. It's just like playing a musical instrument. When you start, you're clumsy. And as you continually go back, you refine those muscles that are necessary for the production of the quality of sound. But it's the same with intuition. You have to keep going back and then it will deepen
and become more natural. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I adopt the position, which was not native to me in my youth. That's for sure. There's got to be a reason that we are living in this material world. I don't know what other people are supposed to do, but I do know that there are tools of self-examination, such that the obstacles to doing what we came here to do can be reduced, or even eventually superseded.
And what do you think we came here to do?
Oh, it varies. Every being, it varies. This is my understanding, and this is a rephrasing of stuff I've heard lots of spiritual teachers say. But there's no one thing we're all supposed to do, except insofar as learning how to find our genuine nature and purposes. But I am convinced from experience, from letting myself see that sort of thing. I mean, I was supposedly the brainy one, and my brother was the jock, right? And that's a complete story. But that meant that I didn't, until I was 65, work out at the gym. It never took.
Yeah.
Until I was able to let go of that. I don't know that that's an example of finding intuition, but actually it was finding something that has become very important to me, which is a
great example of identification. And I call it sophisticated sleepwalking, but we've talked about it, about being asleep, just literally having no idea that that's directing you or not directing you.
That's right.
Exercise.
That's right. I mean, I would repeat it, to people, and then just leave it on the table, as it were.
Yeah, like this is the truth.
Yeah.
But my son, my 22-year-old, is involved in a spiritual community, and all these things come out of my mouth, and he just walks around going, "Belief, that's a belief, that's a belief." Like he just constant reminder, like, all right. Those are just.
Well, I'll say to the question of what did we come here to do. Like Rob, I'd say there's no particular thing. I think what's important is that we find meaning in our lives, and that it's the meaning that we find in our lives that feeds the divine. And so the obstacles to finding meaning is when we're in this kind of anxious state of identification. And when we can clear that away, we can allow something more natural, something more innate in us, our true sense of why we're here in this place at this time, to emerge. And that's where we find meaning. And it could be meaning in one's family. It could be meaning in a creative project. It could be meaning in gardening. It could be meaning in certain kinds of spiritual practice. There's all sorts of ways. Music. There's and just being generous to someone. There's all sorts of ways we can find meaning, and that, like I said, that's what feeds the divine. And it's
well, in the fourth way, Stuart's just several times referenced to feeding the divine.
Yeah.
That's because when we open our capacities to be present to what's going on, that's the opportunity for the divine to feed us.
Yeah.
And so in the fourth way, it's a reciprocal relationship with the divine.
Yeah.
Right. We are here to give something. Give back what we give back to the divine.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
that's something that we don't normally think about, right? At all.
Yeah, I think Gurdjieff refers to that as pain for our arising.
Yeah.
That's right.
Paying for our arising. Yeah.
But we pay with our attention, and we pay with our attention to life.
Right.
And our presence.
Yes, and our presence and attention to life is what gives meaning.
I find that such a calming idea, right? Because in this world where we're striving and I've got to do this to prove my worth and be the best and do all these things and everything, it doesn't have to be in all those things. I think about this a lot. Like, we're all given different gifts, right? And we have our individual gifts, but it doesn't mean that is even what I'm here to do or have to do, right? Like if I'm articulate and I'm a good speaker, that doesn't mean I have to do that. I may want to because it brings me joy. I also sing well. It doesn't mean I'm going to be or need to be that person to reach my ultimate, right? I could keep all of these gifts and not do any of that and express them in a much smaller way.
Well, that's why I brought up the example of putting attention on a grocery store clerk.
Yeah.
Right. It's like I can brighten a person's day by simply putting attention for a minute or two on these people and responding appropriately to the intuition that arises about what would be fun for that person to hear and for me to say. I like being witty.
Yeah. And there's meaning in it, right? It doesn't mean that you're
absolutely, and it doesn't have to. It's not like, oh, my purpose is to be nice to grocery clerks,
right?
I suppose you could create an Uber category of being generous to people, and that might be one thing I could do. But when I was in academia, I was asking questions that nobody else asked, and that was fun.
Yeah.
I had fantastic conversations with colleagues from that position. So it's not just one thing.
Yeah.
I don't think.
I love it. So I always ask people if there's one thing that you would like to, like if you could just take people and shake them and just say, if you just understood this one thing, I just really need you to know this. What would that be?
I think I'll start by just saying, one of the common threads that I see throughout all spiritual traditions, the intuition is you are not your thoughts.
Mm.
And when we have that moment of actually seeing that, even for a microsecond, that is a moment of enlightenment. That is so critical. And it's so critical now because everyone is focused their attention out on this projected world that we create, and very rarely come back internally. And when we do the same thing internally. We atomize ourselves psychologically with all these concepts, and it's none of that. It's none of that.
Beautiful.
Well, I was going to say something else, but now I'm going to flip what you said. It's not that we're not those things that you just mentioned. We are much more.
Yeah.
We are much more. Just in as a product of the earlier conversational thread we were pursuing there, we don't even know how much we can contribute,
Yeah.
how much generosity, how many hearts we can touch, how much love we can share. So we're more than any thought in your head.
Agreed. I love it. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for being here with me today. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been enjoyable.